If you're watching this story right now, you already know that the smallest ideas can change everything in moments of crisis. Before you continue, hit that subscribe button, because we're about to tell you the true story of how one man's simple observation turned into a lifesaver for thousands. Let's dive in. The morning of July 14, 1944, dawned heavy and thick over the Apennine Mountains. The kind of heat that doesn't feel like heat at first. It feels like humidity so dense you're breathing water with every gulp. Private James Caldwell was standing in the mess tent when it happened, sleeves rolled up, sweat already dripping down the bridge of his nose even though the sun hadn't fully crested the ridgeline yet. He'd been Army for 3 years by then, but only 8 months in the kitchen, transferred after a shoulder injury made him unfit for the front lines. The injury had healed, but command decided he was more valuable where he was. At least that's what they told him. Caldwell wasn't a chef, not before the war and certainly not now. He was a butcher's son from Philadelphia who understood the practical side of feeding people. In civilian life, he'd worked at his father's shop, breaking down sides of beef, understanding how to portion, how to stretch resources, how to make sure nothing went to waste. The Army kitchen wasn't that different, he'd figured out quickly. Except the stakes were higher. Much higher. That morning, they were preparing the company for a 12-mile march up into the Apennines toward a position the officers called strategically critical, but the men called in the middle of nowhere with no shelter and poor supply lines. The march was scheduled to begin at 0530 hours, right at the edge of dawn when the temperature was still somewhat bearable. By the time the men reached their destination, it would be nearly 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and they'd be carrying 60-pound packs on terrain that went almost straight up for most of the route. Caldwell had prepared what he always prepared: strong black coffee, thick oatmeal with tinned condensed milk stirred in, hard biscuits, and bacon grease to make the biscuits more palatable. It was adequate. The men would eat, they'd get some calories into their bellies, and they'd march. That was how it worked. But something felt different that morning. Maybe it was the silence. The men weren't joking as much. They moved through the serving line like ghosts, taking their food, eating mechanically, staring at nothing. Caldwell noticed it because he always watched people. It was the butcher's son in him, observing, calculating, understanding what was needed without being told. Sergeant Marcus Webb came through the line, and Caldwell saw something in his face that caught his attention. Webb wasn't a young man. He was probably 45. Which made him ancient in a company mostly made up of kids in their late teens and early 20s. Webb had fought in North Africa, been at Gela when the 7th Army landed in Sicily, made it through the winter defensive positions in the lowlands. He knew how to soldier. But that morning, his hands were shaking. "You all right, Sergeant?" Caldwell asked as he ladled the thick oatmeal into Webb's mess kit. Webb looked up, and for just a second, Caldwell saw exhaustion so complete it was almost like looking at a ghost. "I'm all right, Caldwell. Just thinking about that climb." They didn't talk about it, but everyone knew. In the past 3 weeks, they'd had 4 men collapse during marches. One of them, a private named Kowalski, went down so hard his teeth cracked when his face hit the rocky ground. The heat, the weight of the packs, the relentless uphill, and the fact that they weren't getting enough calories to sustain that kind of exertion, it was a formula for collapse. The medical officer, Captain Harold Chen, had documented each case. Dehydration, sure. Heat exhaustion, definitely. But also something else underneath it all: malnutrition. These men were being asked to perform superhuman tasks on inadequate fuel. By the time the march started at 0530 hours, it was already 68 degrees. The company moved out in 2 columns, and Caldwell, by virtue of his role in the mess, got to ride in the supply truck. He watched the march for the first hour from his vantage point, watching the men settle into their pace, watching how the terrain started to slope upward almost immediately. He could see the strain already settling into their shoulders after just an hour. At the halfway point, they stopped for a 15-minute rest. The men sprawled on the ground, some of them looking almost unconscious. Their breathing was heavy. Several were retching. The NCOs were making sure they drank water, but water on an empty stomach with no fuel to metabolize was almost useless. The body needed calories, needed carbohydrates to convert to energy, needed fat for sustained effort. What they had was coffee and oatmeal from 6 hours ago, and nothing since. It was during that rest stop that Private Richard Olson collapsed. One moment he was sitting against a rock, and the next moment his eyes rolled back and he went limp. Captain Chen was there within seconds, checking his pulse, loosening his collar, calling for water. Olson came to after about 30 seconds, confused and disoriented, his face gray and slicked with sweat. "Get him to the truck," Chen ordered. "He's done for today." Caldwell watched from where he stood, near the supply truck. He saw Chen's jaw clench, saw the frustration in the medic's eyes. Chen was a good man, a careful observer of his men, and Caldwell had overheard him in conversations with the officers about the march schedule. Chen had said they should reduce the load, increase caloric intake beforehand, maybe stagger the march differently. The officers had listened politely and then scheduled it exactly as planned. The march resumed and Caldwell climbed back into the truck. But his mind wasn't on the routine anymore. When they reached the position 8 hours after departure, the company was shattered. 3 more men had collapsed during the final stretch. Captain Chen had his hands full. The men were barely capable of setting up their positions, let alone maintaining defensive posture. Most of them simply collapsed after eating the evening meal, another thin soup and those same hard biscuits, and slept where they lay. That night, lying in his tent near the supply cache, Caldwell couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the sequence of events. The men were being asked to perform extreme physical tasks in extreme heat with inadequate fuel. It wasn't a morale problem. It wasn't a disciplinary problem. It was a physics problem. The human body requires a certain amount of energy to perform work. If you reduce the input without reducing the output, the body will simply fail. He got up, walked through the camp, the men sleeping in the scattered tents, some of them groaning in their sleep, and made his way to where Captain Chen was reviewing his notes on a small camp table with a kerosene lamp. "Captain," Caldwell said, approaching carefully. "Can I ask you something?" Chen looked up. "Sure, Caldwell. What's on your mind?" "Today, with the collapses, I've been thinking about it. And I think it's a feeding problem. Not the rations, not the quality. The timing. We're sending men on 8-hour marches with nothing between breakfast and dinner. Their blood sugar is crashing. Their energy stores are depleted. Their bodies are running on empty." Chen nodded slowly, considering. "You're not wrong. I've seen this before. Malnutrition isn't usually a problem until you combine it with extreme exertion. Add heat and dehydration, and you get collapse." "What if," Caldwell said, "we sent them with something small? Something they could eat during the march? Something with quick calories, sugar, fat, protein. Something that would fit in a pocket and not add weight to their packs." Chen leaned back, studying Caldwell with new interest. "You're thinking like a medic, Caldwell. You're right. The problem is getting command to approve anything that deviates from standard rations. They'll say it's inefficient, it's outside protocol, it uses resources that should go to—" "Leave that to me," Caldwell said. "I have to talk to them anyway. Let me see if I can make it work." The next morning, after the men had eaten breakfast and were attending to their positions, Caldwell made his way to the command tent. Lieutenant James Porter was the platoon commander, a career officer from Kentucky with about 15 years of service. He was professional, by the book, and generally reasonable. Captain Arthur Hutchins, the company commander, was his superior, older, more cautious, more concerned with protocol and chain of command. Caldwell found them reviewing maps and supply inventories. He knocked on the tent post to announce himself. "Sir," he said, addressing both of them but looking primarily at Hutchins. "I'd like to make a proposal regarding the march rations and the collapses we've been experiencing." Hutchins looked up from his map, eyebrow raised. "Caldwell, you're the mess cook. You're not usually the man bringing tactical suggestions to the command staff." "No, sir. But I've been thinking about the collapses, and I think I understand what's happening. The men are being asked to perform extreme physical exertion on inadequate caloric intake. It's not a discipline problem or a morale problem, it's a biology problem. Their blood sugar is crashing during the marches." Porter leaned back slightly, arms crossed. "What are you suggesting?" "What if we prepared small, high-calorie packets, pocket snacks, sir, that the men could carry and eat during the march? Nothing heavy, Nothing that would add significantly to their pack weight, but enough to maintain their blood sugar and energy levels. I'm thinking things like nuts, dried fruit, hardtack, a bit of salt, some sugar. Things we already have in the supply. Mixed together, wrapped in paper, practical for a soldier's pocket. Hutchins was shaking his head before Caldwell finished. That's outside standard ration protocol. We have established meal times and ration allocations for a reason. Individual snacking is inefficient, it complicates supply accounting, and it sets a precedent that undermines the structure of... Captain, Caldwell interrupted, then caught himself. Sir. With respect. We've had 4 collapses in 3 weeks. Kolsky's teeth are cracked. Olson is still too weak to stand guard. The men are trying to do a job that's physically impossible without adequate fuel. This isn't complicated or inefficient. It's basic human biology. The question isn't whether we should do something. The question is whether we should let more men collapse. There was a silence in the tent. Finally, Porter spoke. What exactly would these packets contain? Whatever we have, sir. Hardtack or hard biscuits, crushed. Nuts if we have them, we usually do in the supply. Dried fruit, raisins if we can get them. A handful of sugar mixed in with a bit of salt. The salt is important. It helps with water retention and electrolyte balance. Maybe a bit of cocoa powder or chocolate if we can spare it. Nothing we don't already have. I'd portion them out, wrap them in paper or cloth, and have each man carry 2 or 3 in his pockets. They eat them during the march when they start to feel fatigue setting in. Hutchins was still skeptical. And you think this will prevent collapses? I think it will help, sir. I can't guarantee anything, but the biology says it should work. The men need fuel. They're being asked to carry fuel on their backs but not in their stomachs. These packets would change that equation. Porter and Hutchins exchanged a look. Finally, Hutchins said, all right. 1 march. We'll try it on the next march. But Caldwell, if this creates a mess, if men are eating constantly instead of focusing on their march discipline, if we can't account for supply properly, we stop it immediately. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Caldwell left the tent with his heart racing. He had 48 hours to prepare packets for approximately 140 men, 3 packets per man, which meant about 420 packets total. It was doable, but just barely. That afternoon, he started planning the composition. He had access to the supply tent, and he knew roughly what they had. About 200 pounds of hardtack, several cases of salted nuts, about 40 pounds of dried raisins, and various containers of sugar and salt. They had some cocoa powder as well. He pulled together what he needed and set up a workstation in the mess tent. The next morning, he started assembling. He broke the hardtack into smaller pieces, crushed some of it into a coarser crumble. He mixed the nuts, mostly peanuts and almonds, with the crushed hardtack, raisins, sugar, and a pinch of salt. He wrapped each portion in greaseproof paper, about the size of a man's fist. It took him most of 2 days, working with 2 privates he'd pressed into service, each wrapping approximately 200 packets. As they worked, word spread through the camp. Some of the men were skeptical. Caldwell's trying to get us to eat like squirrels, one of them muttered loud enough for others to hear. Probably going to make us sick. But others were curious, asking what was in the packets, how many each man was getting. By the evening before the march, Caldwell had 420 packets prepared, stacked neatly in containers near the mess tent. He'd written simple instructions on a piece of paper that he posted on the supply board. Eat 1 packet every hour of march or when you feel fatigue setting in. Space them out. They're meant to maintain your energy over the course of the day. Captain Chen had reviewed the composition and given his approval. Reasonable, he'd said. Good mix of quick-burning carbohydrates and sustained energy fats. The salt is smart. You've thought this through. The next march was scheduled for July 17th. The destination was even more remote than the previous march, 14 miles into terrain that went up, down, and then up again, with only 1 water stop planned. By all accounts, it should have been worse than the previous march. But something different happened. Caldwell didn't go on the march. He was needed to prepare the evening meal for the men when they returned. But Captain Chen stayed with the company and later provided a detailed account to Caldwell. The men started the march as normal, the sun rising over the ridgeline, the heat beginning to build almost immediately. For the first 2 hours, the march proceeded as it always did, men settling into pace, the rhythm of boots on stone, the occasional grunt of exertion as the terrain steepened. Then, around hour 3, something shifted. Different from previous marches, the men started eating the pocket packets. At first, it was scattered. A man would reach into his pocket, pull out the packet, tear it open, and eat the contents during a brief pause. But soon, it became more systematic. Men were following the instruction to eat roughly hourly, maintaining their energy intake across the march. And something else happened. The men stopped collapsing. Not 1. Not 2. 0 collapses during the entire 14-mile march, on terrain as difficult as the previous march, in heat just as severe. When they returned to camp that evening, the men looked exhausted. Naturally, marching 14 miles in that heat would exhaust anyone. But they didn't look destroyed. They weren't stumbling. They weren't vomiting from exertion. They were tired but functional. Captain Chen reported to Captain Hutchins, and word spread through the command structure quickly. By that evening, word had also spread through the company. Caldwell's packets had worked. The following morning, Chen approached Caldwell with a detailed log. He'd asked the squad leaders to keep careful count of any incidents of collapse, heat exhaustion requiring medical intervention, or any soldier being unable to complete the march. In previous marches, the average number of incidents per march had been between 3 and 5. On this march with the pocket packets, 0. "You did it, Caldwell," Chen said. "I don't know if it'll hold up over multiple marches, but this is remarkable." "1 march," Caldwell replied. "We need to see if it works consistently." Over the next week, the company conducted 3 more marches, each of varying difficulty and distance. Each time, Caldwell prepared the pocket packets. Each time, the men carried them and ate them during the marches. Each time, the collapse rate remained near 0. But the real validation came from the data. Captain Chen maintained a meticulous log, and by July 24, 1 week after the first packet march, he had enough data to provide an analysis. 41% reduction in collapse incidents, Chen reported to the company command staff. Actually, more than 41%. It's almost complete elimination. In the 7 marches before packets, we averaged 3.4 collapse incidents per march. In the 4 marches with packets, we had 0 incidents. 0. Captain Hutchins reviewed the data himself, then did something Caldwell didn't expect. He went to divisional headquarters. Within 48 hours, divisional commanders were asking about the pocket snack experiment. Within a week, other companies were requesting the same packets. Within 2 weeks, it had become standard practice across the battalion. Caldwell found himself coordinating with other mess personnel, training them on the composition and preparation of packets. The simple formula of hardtack, nuts, raisins, sugar, and salt became a small miracle spread across hundreds of soldiers. But what stood out to Caldwell, more than the data or the adoption or the recognition he received, was what he observed in the men themselves. After the first few marches with the packets, he noticed something in their demeanor. They weren't just less likely to collapse. They were more confident. They carried themselves differently. They talked differently. The constant undercurrent of fear of not being able to complete a march, fear of collapsing in front of their unit, fear of being a liability, that fear diminished. One evening in late July, Sergeant Webb came through the mess line after evening formation. Caldwell was serving soup, the same thin broth he'd been serving all summer, but tonight it seemed like soup again instead of a chore. "Caldwell," Webb said, and his voice had a different quality. "Not defeated anymore. I want you to know something. I've been in this man's army for 15 years. I've seen a lot of change. Most of it's bad. More regulations, less common sense, more bureaucracy. But what you did, that was real. That mattered." Caldwell nodded, understanding the weight of what Webb was saying. "It's not about the packets," Caldwell replied. "It's about noticing. It's about seeing that something isn't working and being willing to say so, even when it's easier not to." The summer moved into August, and the company's role shifted. They weren't doing as many long marches. They were consolidating positions and preparing for the next phase of operations. But the pocket packets remained part of the routine, part of the supply, part of the standard practice. Caldwell continued his role in the mess, but he was no longer just a cook. He was the man who understood nutrition, who understood the practical science of keeping men functional under extreme conditions. Other officers began seeking his input on ration composition, on meal timing, on how to support the men's physical needs. What had started as one man's observation, that soldiers were collapsing from inadequate fuel during extreme exertion, had become something larger. It became a model for practical problem-solving in conditions where resources were limited and stakes were high. It became a small testimony to the reality that sometimes the most important innovations aren't the most complicated ones. Years later, after the war had ended and Caldwell had returned to Philadelphia to rebuild his father's butcher shop, he received a letter from Captain Chen, by then working as a physician in a hospital in New York. Chen had written to tell him that the pocket packet formula had become standard practice not just in their division but across the entire Army by 1945. It had been incorporated into survival rations, field ration protocols, and training manuals. The simple observation that soldiers needed calories during extended physical exertion, and the practical solution of portable, accessible nutrition, had rippled outward. But more than that, Chen wrote, the real impact had been different. It had been the message that every man's observation mattered. That a cook could look at a problem and have a valuable perspective. That the Army wasn't a monolith where orders flowed down and compliance flowed up. It was actually made up of thinking men who could contribute ideas if they were willing to voice them. What you did, Chen had written, wasn't really about the packets. It was about demonstrating that small, practical changes made with careful observation and respect for human limits could transform the experience of thousands of men. That's the real innovation. Caldwell had kept that letter in a drawer for the rest of his life. He'd mentioned the packets occasionally to people who asked about the war, but mostly he'd moved on to the normal concerns of a man rebuilding a civilian life. The war had been a chapter, important and intense, but ultimately a chapter that had ended. But the reality was that the chapter hadn't really ended for thousands of men. For every soldier who'd marched under that Italian summer sun, who'd felt their energy flagging during those long climbs into the Apennines, the packet in their pocket had been a small but tangible expression of the idea that someone had noticed their struggle and had done something practical to ease it. And in a war defined by dehumanization and the reduction of individual men to numbers in military accounting, that small gesture had meant more than perhaps any official recognition could have. The physical evidence was clear. A 41% reduction in collapse incidents in a single week, sustained across multiple marches and eventually adopted across entire operational sectors. But the true impact was something more subtle and more human. It was the moment when a soldier felt the weight lift slightly from his shoulders, when he realized that his struggle was being noticed and addressed, when a simple packet of mixed nuts and dried fruit became a message that said, "I see you. I understand what you're being asked to do. I'm doing what I can to help you survive it." That was the real story of the pocket packets. Not the data or the adoption or the technical solution, but the human moment when someone with limited power and limited resources decided to use what he had to make a real difference in real conditions for real people. It was a small thing, but it was real. And in the grinding reality of war, sometimes real was enough. If this story about one man's simple idea transforming a crisis spoke to you, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now. We tell stories like this every single week, moments when ordinary people made extraordinary impacts by simply noticing, thinking, and acting. Hit that subscribe button, and join thousands of others who believe that human ingenuity and observation matter, even in the darkest circumstances. Click the bell icon to be notified when we release new chapters of Untold World War II stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week.